After the relief of '96 by Lord Francis Marion and the British evacuation of that post, the British forces fell back upon the coast, taking with them many of the loyalists who could get out and who would follow them. After all, Georgetown was destined to fall to Francis Marion. Fort Watson and Fort Motte already had fallen. Fort Granby, Columbia, South Carolina, had been taken by the Americans. Orangeburg was in American hands. Camden had been evacuated. The war now moves onto the coast. And the population, with victory possibly in view, began to rally to the standards of the American commanders, and Greene, Nathanael Greene, baffled so many times, defeated tactically so many times, is to become the strategic victor, the American Fabius again, conquering in the long run. The next battle, of course, was at Eutaw Springs, where British forces, watching the approach roads to Charleston, attempted to stop an American advance which was destined to win. You have to look at the state. '96, Camden, Granby, Motte, Watson, Georgetown. Only Savannah and Charleston and the area immediately around Savannah and Charleston and the coast between now lay in British hands. The American forces under Nathanael Greene were pressing in on all sides. And in the north, the Yorktown campaign already was underway. This is the end of the war. This is the beginning of the end, when the British realize that victory no longer is possible and only do their best to get their troops out in as good order as they possibly can. Sumter, Marion in this area here, Sumter in the upcountry and working down south of Orangeburg, south and east. All the great partisans, Elijah Clark in Georgia, all the great partisan forces now were gathering behind Nathanael Greene, and the armies were pressing down out of the high hills of the Santee to meet the British in one of the last engagements of the war. Now let us go to Eutaw Springs. We are standing today on the park set aside to commemorate the Battle of Eutaw Springs. Now, the terrain is completely different. I shall ask you to use your imaginations rather strongly. I must be standing just in front of the old road. The battle was fought astride that road. This would be the British left wing, the American right wing. The waters of Lake Marion cover the rest of the battlefield. The Battle of Eutaw Springs thus is claimed as a victory by both sides. Tactically, the honors belong with the British, since Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Stewart, commanding British and Loyalist forces, held the field at the end of the battle, and Nathanael Greene broke off the action and retreated. The engagement, however, was hotly contested. Casualties were heavy, very heavy for such small numbers involved on both sides. And the Americans at one point were very close to winning the battle itself. In the long view, it became an American strategic victory, since Stewart was forced by his heavy losses and a hostile countryside to fall back on Charleston. It also was the last major battle fought in South Carolina and a final link in the chain of events when Nathanael Greene, who never won a major engagement, finally emerged as the unquestioned victor in South Carolina. in South Carolina and Georgia. Here, victory was not sufficient for the British. The American armies had to be destroyed and the countryside totally pacified. This the British never were able to accomplish. Terrain, climate, disease, and their inability and notable lack of success in winning the majority of the people to the British cause, plus the indefatigable activities of the great partisan leaders like Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, Elijah Clark, William Davie of North Carolina, and others, won the war in the South. Nathanael Greene, having crossed the Congaree, now advanced by deliberate, slow stages, give time for Brigadier General Francis Marion to join him with his brigade of veteran militia. This junction took place on September 7th, about 7 miles from Eutaw. Nathanael Greene now had a force of approximately 2,300 men, including 700 militia and 1,600 Continentals, regulars, horse, foot, and guns. At 4 in the morning of September the 8th, Nathanael Greene broke camp at Henry Lawrence Farm, up the road which lay right behind me here, and marched with his army to attack the British at Eutaw, 7 miles away. At 6 in the morning, 2 deserters from Nathanael Greene's army came in with news that the Americans were moving to the attack. Unfortunately for the British, this report was not credited, and the 2 men were arrested and confined. As a matter of fact, Stuart was not aware of the near approach of Nathanael Greene and sent out a party of 400 unarmed men with a small armed guard to dig sweet potatoes to feed his hungry army. This operation took place up the very road that the deserters had informed Alexander Stuart Nathanael Greene was using for his approach march. Nathanael Greene advanced in 2 columns with artillery at the head of each. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lee riding in front with the cavalry of his legion, and William Washington with his Virginia light horse watching the rear. About 8 in the morning, 4 miles from the British camp, Captain James Armstrong of Lee's Legion reported the approach of what turned out to be the routing party. These were attacked promptly, the American cavalry swinging around to the rear of the unfortunate foragers. Most of the unarmed routing party escaped, as did the mounted escorts, but several infantry soldiers were killed and 40 were captured with their captain. With the alarm given, both armies now formed for battle. The Americans moving up in the 2 columns, each composed of the corps, with an assigned position, now swung into that position. The first line of 4 battalions of North Carolina and South Carolina militia, led by Colonel Francois Malmedy, a French Marquis and a volunteer with the American Army, and Brigadiers Francis Marion and Andrew Pickens, respectively, with the guns on the Charleston Road behind me here. Nathanael Greene's second line consisted of 2 North Carolina regiments of regulars on the right. These were the militia fugitives of Guilford Courthouse, who'd run in front of the British attack, condemned to serve 12 months as Continental regulars. The North Carolinians were commanded by Brigadier Jethro Sumner. 2 Virginia regular regiments, led by Lieutenant Colonel Richard Campbell, formed the center, with the 2 Maryland regiments under Othel Williams and John Eager Howard, veteran commanders, with the left on the Charleston Road and 2 guns on that road. Jethro Sumner's men and the South Carolina state troops, led by Colonel William Henderson, flanked on the left, and Lee's Legion flanked on the right. of the Delaware Battalion under Colonel Robert Kirkwood and Colonel George Baylor's horse, old Baylor's horse, led by William Washington, formed the reserve behind the American army. The two 3-pounder field guns were in front of the first line of militia, as stated on the road, and the two 6-pounders with the second line. With the first alarm, the British commander, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Stewart, had formed a line of battle with his camp and tents behind it across the road on the heights near Eutaw Springs, just where we're standing now. He had 6 veteran regiments, the 3rd, the 63rd, the 64th, the Grenadiers, the New York Volunteers, a Loyalist regiment, and the New Jersey Volunteers, also a Loyalist outfit, about 1,800 men in all. The Buffs, or 3rd Regiment, composed his right, resting its flank on the Charleston Road that ran behind me here. Colonel John Harris Kruger of 96 fame, a New York Loyalist with the New York and New Jersey Volunteers, crack outfits, held the center. With the 63rd and 64th Veteran Regiments on the left. I'm standing on their line just about. Major John Marjoribanks, a very gallant and able officer, destined to die in the fighting unhappily, commanded the Grenadiers and Light Infantry, making one battalion of 300 men. This force covered the right flank of the British, was stationed across the road in an obtuse angle with its right about 100 paces from the Eutaw stream, which ran right behind us here in the old days. The left being on the road behind a thick hedge, a sturdy brick house and a fenced garden lay behind the British line of battle, just about on that point over there. The British horse with a force of infantry was stationed in reserve. Their artillery was placed part on the Charleston Road and part along the road leading through the British left wing to the brick house over on the point. The American militia, contrary to the hesitation which they often displayed, they were veterans now, advanced and engaged the enemy line hotly. These were mostly battle-trained men, battle-tried men, and led by Brigadier General Francis Marion and Andrew Pickens. Leadership, as always, making all the difference in the behavior of troops under fire. The 63rd and Henry Lee's Legion Infantry on the American right flank were warmly engaged in a firefight. The 69th, 64th, with some of John Harris Kruger's men, advanced on Francois Malmedy's North Carolina militia, and these men, after fighting very well indeed, fell back in good order, leaving William Henderson's South Carolina state troops on the left and Lee's Legion on the right, still holding position and fighting hard. Nathanael Greene now ordered Jethro Sumner's North Carolina Continentals to fill the gap. And the fighting became general and more hot. Musketry fire running in steady volleys from flank to flank of both armies. And remember, I'm standing just about where the British Army was standing facing the Americans. Alexander Stewart now brought his reserve infantry into line and swung his small cavalry force to a position on the left to guard against a turning movement by Lee on the American right. During this period, the South Carolinian Colonel William Henderson, commanding the South Carolina state troops, was severely wounded and taken out of action. But his second in command, Colonel Wade Hampton, continued the action with obstinate courage. Nathanael Greene now brought up the Virginian and Maryland Line regiments, the Continentals, for the final blow, while Stewart sent his refused right flanking force under Major John Marjoribanks into action for the first time. Thusly, Washington, with the American reserve, was ordered to attack the British right flank. John Majora Banks' left on the road here was covered, now you must use your imaginations, by a thick blackjack oak hedge, right in here. And the ground generally was grown up in blackjack oak, small pine, and Washington thus could not force his way through. Majora Banks also met the American attack with disciplined volley fire. William Washington was wounded, unhorsed, and captured. Henry Lee, however, with the Legion infantry, swung around the enemy left flank, just about beyond where we're standing now, and their entire left began to give way. Fighting was so close as the whole American line surged forward, except the left where Washington's men had been beaten back. But soldiers of the Maryland line and soldiers of the Buffs, fighting hand to hand right in here, were found mutually transfixed after the battle by each other's bayonets. The British gave way generally except for a force under Major Henry Sheridan of the New York Volunteers, which flung itself into the brick house down here on the point and could not be dislodged. John Majora Banks, a delightful name, although victorious on the British right, was forced back to cover, fell back to cover his retreating comrades with his grenadiers and light infantry. The Americans, pressing by the house and garden, captured the British camp right in here, where the Americans discovered, I'm sorry to say, quantities of food and notably rum. Soon, most of the American militia and even soldiers of the Virginia and Maryland line were plain roaring drunk, happily oblivious to the battle which continued on all sides of them. The men of Henry Lee's Legion and the Delawares of the Reserve now tried vainly to take the house and garden. They're approximately there on the point. The Americans, who'd almost won the battle, having captured prisoners and 2 pieces of British artillery in their advance, proceeded to lose the battle. One detachment of Lee's Legion, led by a Lieutenant Lawrence Manning, whose family still lives in South Carolina, almost got into the house, following hard on John Harris Kruger's men. The door was slammed shut in their faces. Henry Sheridan, now holding the house, poured his fire in all directions from muskets and a few light swivel pieces. John Majora Banks on the right remained unbroken in the garden, as did the British cavalry, which formed on the left in an open field west of the Charleston Road. These now charged the Americans, plundering the camp. The hard-fighting Wade Hampton, who would replace the wounded Colonel William Henderson, collected a few American horsemen, countercharged the British dragoons, and drove them back. This brought him under fire from John Majora Banks, and Wade Hampton, in his turn, was forced to retire, his impromptu American cavalry shattered. John Majora Banks now made a furious sortie, a very gallant officer, Majora Banks, and seized 2 American field guns, and then fell back into position again around the house. Unhappily, the gallant major, who with Henry Sheridan of the New York Volunteers and the South Carolinian Wade Hampton were the only real heroes of this engagement, John Majora Banks fell mortally wounded in the attack. But it gave Alexander Stewart time to reform his line and attack again the disorganized Americans. General Nathanael Greene brought up all of his available artillery to break the house walls so that an assault might dislodge its stubborn defenders. The house at Eutaw Springs playing the same role as the Chew House had done in the Battle of Germantown. in the north. The guns proved too light to effect the breach in the sturdily built house. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lee, still on the right, now saw a chance to turn the head of the ravine right behind us here, over the slope, and strike the British cavalry on the flank and rear. This would have placed the Americans in a position to command the Charleston Road, and thus the main avenue of British retreat. Apparently, when Lee took command of his Legion infantry for the first advance, General Nathanael Greene had directed that Henry Lee's cavalry should be placed at his own disposal. It had been scattered in the unsuccessful mounted attack on the left by William Washington, and only one troop appeared now to support Henry Lee. The Americans were beginning to reorganize after the hapless misadventure of the captured rum here in the camp. John Eager Howard of the Marylanders, a very fine officer, had just commenced action again between the house and the ravine over behind us here, when Howard was seriously wounded, carried from the field, and Henry Lee, unsupported, fell back. Alexander Stewart now ordered a general advance, recovering one of his field pieces captured earlier, moving thusly by the Americans and seizing 2 American guns. Nathanael Greene now withdrew his thoroughly confused army, not really beaten and certainly not really victorious. He sent Henry Lee under a flag to Alexander Stewart with a request that both sides unite in burying the dead lying here on this field, and Stewart, having suffered heavy losses, held the field but advanced no further. The action, one of the most hotly contested in the war, with all troops behaving uncommonly well on both sides, lasted about 3 hours. Greene said later that the South Carolina militia, led by the redoubtable Francis Marion and Andrew Pickens, fought like the veterans of Frederick the Great. The Americans lost approximately 139 killed, some sources say 120, approximately 375 wounded, and 8 missing, with 60 prisoners taken by the British, among them William Washington, a sad loss. The British suffered 85 killed, 351 wounded, and 480 missing, most of the last being captured by Nathanael Greene. Greene's losses were very heavy for a 3-hour firefight in the 18th century. About 1/4 of his whole army engaged. But the British loss was at least 1/5 of the men engaged, and Alexander Stewart's losses were thus so severe that he could not maintain his position. Nathanael Greene retired 7 miles from the battle scene on the night of the 8th to rest and regroup. He had need to do this. Of 6 commanders bearing Continental commissions, only Colonel Eutaw Williams and Henry Lee survived the battle fought here unwounded. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Campbell of the Virginians was killed leading his men in the decisive first charge that broke the British line. Alexander Stewart claimed the victory in a vainglorious letter to General Clinton in New York. But Stewart fell back on Charleston during the 9th of September, destroying his stores and leaving his most seriously wounded behind. The American light troops and cavalry followed closely the British retreat down the Charleston Road, attempting to cut it off before the column could reach safety. Alexander Stewart moved too fast and made a junction with Major MacArthur marching up from Monk's Corner. This was at a place called Martin's Tavern, and the combined force now fell back and reached Monk's Corner successfully, beating off a mounted attack by Lee's dragoons, following hard in the process. Greene then retreated to Eutaw here and sent his wounded and sick to the better climate of the high hills of the Santee. Alexander Stewart claimed a victory, but again the country above Charleston and Monk's Corner now was in American hands. Congress presented its thanks to Nathanael Greene and to every corps which fought under him. He was presented with a captured British standard and a gold medal commemorating this battle. The Americans had triumphed once more, the American Fabius. Nathanael Greene had triumphed once more after leaving a hard-fought field to a stubborn and brave enemy. It is the time-honored concept of the tactical defeat and the strategic victory. After Eutaw Springs, there were no further engagements involving comparatively large forces in the Carolinas, either Carolina and Georgia. The British, who in 1780, after the capture of Charleston, after the Battle of the Waxhaws, after Camden and Fishing Creek, had controlled most of South Carolina and Georgia, now were confined to the small area around Charleston. And there they were to stay until the final British evacuation on December 14th, 1782. It was a long, grim struggle. The city had fallen to General Sir Henry Clinton on May 12th, 1780, more than 2.5 years before. The war now moves to Virginia. There were actions still, loyalists in North Carolina, some raids, but the major area of the war now moves to the York and James Peninsula, the naval battles off the Capes between the British and the French navies, and to, of course, the final investment, capture of Yorktown and the surrender of Cornwallis.